Wonderful. Thank you, Karen, for starting the recording. Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, How to Hire, Retain, and Promote for Diverse Public Sector Leadership. My name is Amy Zarzeczny. I'm an associate professor with the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at our University of Regina campus, and I'm very pleased to serve as your moderator for this afternoon's event. The Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS, as we call ourselves, is a national hub for advanced study and research in public policy administration. We are a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan, and largely based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that has defined much of the work in the province of Saskatchewan. Since our inception in 2007, we have swiftly become one of Canada's leading policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants who are interested in and devoted to advancing public value. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place online, JSGS's physical homes are located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. In addition to these territories, today's speaker is joining us from Victoria, the traditional lands of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We are glad to welcome all of you joining us from across Turtle Island, and I make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose lands and territories on which we reside or are visiting. For those of you who are new to the EDI Discussion series, I'm very pleased to welcome you today. This series focuses on engaging current and future public servants on issues pertaining to equity, diversity, and inclusion in the public sector. This series is proudly supported by the Max Bell Foundation, who encourage the development of forward-looking innovations that impact public policies and practices. And if you'd like more information on the Max Bell Foundation and their work, please see the link that Karen will provide in the chat. Today's discussion will be focusing on how public sector organizations can build organizational capacity to support those who have traditionally faced barriers. As Accessibility Commissioner, our speaker, Commissioner Michael Gottheil, is responsible for leading the administration and enforcement of the Accessible Canada Act, which aims to realize a barrier-free Canada by 2040. He will be sharing some of his insights about how organizations can take proactive measures to identify and remove barriers to accessibility and prevent the creation of new barriers. Today's topic may raise difficult emotions or serve as a trigger for some participants. If you are experiencing distress as a result of this presentation, please take a look in the chat again for a list of resources that Karen will provide. To help this afternoon's event run smoothly, we ask that all attendees please stay muted and keep your videos off during the initial portion of the event, but please do feel free to turn your videos back on when we start the audience question and answer period. I will first introduce our speaker. We will then begin with a moderated question and answer period to lay some of the foundation around this topic and start to dig into some of the deeper issues. And this will give you, our audience, some time to reflect on questions that you would like to pose to Commissioner Gottheil. I will open it up for an audience question and answer period. And during that time, if you would like to ask a question, please send it to me directly in the chat. Again, my name is Amy Zarzeczny, and I will be happy to pose it on your behalf. If you have any logistical questions or challenges that arise during the presentation, please send a message to Karen Jasser-LaForge via the Zoom's chat, or you can email her at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. Karen will also put her contact information in the chat. Please note that as with all of our EDI presentations, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the JSGS website at a later date. Now that those preliminary logistics are out of the way, I am very pleased to introduce you to our speaker today. Commissioner Michael Gottheil is Canada's first Accessibility Commissioner appointed under the Accessible Canada Act. He brings many years of leadership experience in the administrative justice sector, having previously served as Chief of Commission and Tribunals of the Alberta Human Rights Commission, Chair of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, and Executive Chair of both the Environment and Land Tribunals Ontario and the Social Justice Tribunals Ontario. A graduate of Osgoode Hall Law School, he has also practiced labor, employment, and human rights law for close to 20 years. Commissioner Gottheil is a frequent presenter at conferences and seminars and has written widely on human rights, accessibility and inclusion, administrative law, institutional design, and alternative models of dispute resolution. He has always been open to sharing his experiences and to being inquisitive about others' differences, challenges, and insights. He's a firm believer that by listening and hearing diverse perspectives, we all grow stronger individually and as a community. His journey living with vision loss has informed his collaboration with the disability community and all those who are committed to equity and human rights. So thank you so much, Commissioner Gottheil, for joining us today, and welcome to this series. We really appreciate your time and sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
So as we start our discussion, I think it might be helpful for us to begin with just a few sort of fairly basic and foundational questions to ensure that all of us here present today have a basic working understanding of the context in which you are serving in this role and what it seeks to achieve. So perhaps could you start, again, a very basic question, but with providing us a bit of an overview of the Accessible Canada Act and what it hopes to achieve?
Right. Well, thank you. And thank you again for inviting me. And I feel quite honored to be part of this discussion and to have been appointed Canada's first Accessibility Commissioner. So the Accessibility Commissioner is a position that's established under the Accessible Canada Act, which is the federal accessibility legislation. I noted, and some of you may know, that yesterday, this is timely, yesterday the Saskatchewan government introduced into the legislature accessibility legislation, a bill to enact accessibility legislation for Saskatchewan. So that's quite exciting from my perspective. Of course, my role is under the Accessible Canada Act is to promote compliance and enforce compliance with regulations that would be enacted under the Accessible Canada Act. So just to put that into context, so obviously we live in the Federation where there is federal and provincial jurisdiction. With Saskatchewan, if it enacts the legislation, there'll be 5 provinces that have accessibility legislation. That's Nova Scotia, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. Others are thinking of that. And then with the Accessible Canada Act, the federal government enacted legislation for the federal sector. So what accessibility legislation is, it's often asked, well, what's the difference between accessibility legislation and human rights legislation? Accessibility legislation is human rights, a human rights law, but traditional human rights legislation, Human Rights Act or human rights codes, essentially address complaints brought by individuals about discrimination that they they allege they've experienced. So sometimes it's said that it's addressing discrimination and barriers, marginalization, one complaint at a time. Notwithstanding that some of the barriers and the experiences of people who are marginalized either by race or gender, sexual orientation, disability, and so forth, may face those barriers may be systemic, right? They may be a product of, it could be built environment, steps, and some people in wheelchairs and other mobility disabilities can't get into buildings. It may be for individuals like myself who are blind, inaccessible websites. They also may be attitudinal barriers. They may be barriers with respect to employment, which is what we're speaking about today in terms of requirements that have a disproportionate effect on individuals being able to access certain types of employment or positions. So the human rights legislation may and does say that it is contrary to human rights law to discriminate against an individual in employment or provision of services on the grounds of the number of grounds, race, color, faith or religion, disability, and so forth. Accessibility legislation, by recognizing some of the discriminatory impacts come from systems and processes, seeks to address those on a systemic level. And the construct, if you will, the structure is that governments will work with communities, people with disabilities, industry, educational sectors, researchers, and so forth, to develop standards that are that will remove barriers or prevent the erection of new barriers. So I think most people are familiar with the concept of accessible design or universal design. That's an example of where, all right, rather than building something and fixing it, let's design it in a way that doesn't create barriers for individuals with disabilities. But that can be, extended into employment processes and hiring practices, procurement, so that institutions don't, purchase products that are, web apps or so forth that have built-in barriers. So the focus again is, let's create standards which are then enacted as regulations applicable to a particular sector. So my role is where the federal government enacts standards for federally regulated entity. My role is a regulator to ensure entities, the federal government, federally regulated industries, even parliamentary institutions, the House of Commons and the Senate, comply with those regulations and those standards.
Thank you. That's a very helpful overview. And you did touch very briefly on Saskatchewan's new bill and the other provinces who have also passed accessibility legislation and those considering it. Could you explain a little bit for us how the federal legislation applies in a provincial context and how you see the relationship between those different levels of government when it comes to legislating in this area?
So, as with everything else Canadian and division of powers, the federal government can't regulate in the provincial areas and, within provincial scope of responsibility. So, in the provincial area of responsibility, whether that's businesses, accommodations, universities, and so forth, the Accessible Canada Act does not apply. But this is why it's important, and some provinces have actually enacted accessibility legislation that will apply in the areas where there's provincial responsibilities. Now, in terms of the interaction between the federal and provincial legislation, it's interesting. Certainly the Minister of Economic Social Development, the Honorable Carla Qualtrough, who's responsible for disability matters at the federal level, she indicated that she is quite committed to trying to, I wouldn't use the word harmonize, but to ensure that from the perspective of people with disabilities, there is accessibility and a sort of a program or efforts to remove barriers across the country at all levels. And then from the perspective of businesses, service providers, NGOs, universities, what have you, that there's common standards so that it's, whether somebody's in one province or another, the standards in terms of built environment, for example, or employment or communications, web design, those sorts of things are consistent across the country. And that's also beneficial for businesses and other organizations because there's, a standard. So to that end, the Accessible Canada Act is interesting. It sets up, in addition to my office, the Accessibility Commissioner, it also sets up a governmental agency, independent governmental agency called Accessible Standards Canada. And its responsibility is to develop standards of different types, including the one they're working on now is on information and communication technology, so digital platforms, websites, and those sorts of things. They have other standards that we're working on in terms of built environment. They're working on an interesting one about outdoor, parks, national parks and recreational facilities to make sure they're barrier free. So they developed those standards. That organization developed standards in consultation with people with disabilities, in consultation with a particular sector that is affected, and in consultation with other provinces. Some provinces, like Ontario, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, already have a set of standards because they've had accessibility legislation for a while. So there's no, it doesn't necessarily make sense to go and create a new standard if the ones developed in the particular province has been working. Better to have those discussions, those interprovincial discussions, federal, provincial, territorial discussions to try to harmonize the standards across Canada. So while the federal government doesn't have any power per se to regulate in the provincial sector, there is efforts, and it's well received, I think, by most provinces. And there's an interest both from the disability community and industry to develop national standards, if you will, as we have in other areas. So that's how I think the Accessible Canada Act can have and will have application in terms of across Canada and at the provincial level.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I'm already seeing questions coming in through the chat, which is wonderful. So please, I would invite everyone to do feel free to start sending your questions now. I think there are many interesting avenues to follow up on in this area. So feel free to send those along to me, and I will continue to pose them throughout. One that I'm already seeing a theme of is sort of the focus on an interest in the removal of barriers. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to why that concept is so sort of important and fundamental to the work of your position and the legislation more broadly. And perhaps there's some interest, I think, in, given the focus of today's topic, to what extent, if at all, you see any distinction when we're looking at removal of barriers for questions around recruitment, but then also for retention and promotion in employment contexts?
So again, as I said before, the notion of systemic discrimination or systemic barriers isn't new. It's a concept that had developed under traditional human rights legislation. In terms of programs or policies that might have a disproportionate effect. So, there have been challenges, for example, to employment insurance or disability benefits that perhaps, did disproportionately affect same-sex couples or women in terms of pregnancy. So there have been cases over the years brought under human rights legislation that have been, the discrimination has been articulated as saying, look, these are, it wasn't intentional discrimination, there was no malice, but the program or the system was designed in a way that has a disproportionate effect on certain populations. And so, again, I would call, in some ways, the accessibility legislation sort of the next generation of human rights law. And not to say the previous generation isn't useful. I mean, I'm 66. I still feel like I have some value as traditional human rights legislation, but no, I think it's recognizing that it can be more effective and efficient to address barriers. And secondly, three things. Secondly, it removes the onus on individuals who may be marginalized and experience discrimination in a number of areas of their life, to bring forward cases to challenge existing structures. And so there's all sorts of issues with power and resources in that. But it's also, I think, recognizing that it foregrounds inclusion, right? So it's not that, okay, well, we'll make an exception for you because you have a disability. We'll make an individual sort of accommodation, which can be important, but it's saying, let's design society in a way that is inclusive of all. So I think that's the sort of principles and the benefits behind that. In terms of recruitment, I know, we had discussed sort of areas that people might be interested in. And as myself, as you mentioned in the kind introductions, I've held senior executive positions both in the private sector when I had my law firm, and then in the public sector. A number of the organizations were quite large, with 25 or $50 million budget and 400 employees and those sorts of things. And so, I recognize the challenges when we say we want to increase diversity, right? And I think I do think that business, universities, government have taken really important steps already to try to address that. So we know that just in recruitment, we have focused on merit-based recruitment with structured approaches to open competition and interviews and that sort of thing to try to address biases that might occur. We know that we don't ask questions about, do you have a driver's license? But we understand that people may be able to perform the job, may need alternative forms of accommodation, or the job can be structured differently. So I think that we have done that, but I think some of the problems that remain, and there are many, but let me just identify three, and in no particular order. So, and I've been there myself, so we all know as managers, or you have a busy, well, as they say, managing is one thing after another, and it's endless, and there's no respite, and you're just always busy. And then all of a sudden, somebody announces they're leaving and gives, 2 weeks or 3 weeks notice. And you are freaking out because you have something to deliver in a month. And, this is a critical position, and what are you going to do? And your immediate thought is, okay, who can we get to fill in, right? And then somebody says, well, I know somebody good. They'd be really good, right? And there's an example of where there's a go-to solution that is going to undermine the potential of diversity, right? Is going to potentially exclude people who, people with disability, people who come from non-traditional backgrounds, because of course they're not, that's the whole point, they're marginalized, they're not included in the sphere of colleagues or communities that we are used to working with, right? So you have to be careful you have to be rigorous, right? And say, no, we have a process. This process is important. This process, will help us deliver on our commitment to diversity and open recruitment, and we'll survive, and let's do it, right? So that's one thing. I think the second thing that managers often confront is, do I have the resources, right? Now, part of that is misunderstanding and myths about people with disabilities and, how much it's going to cost the organization to accommodate and those sorts of things. I mean, certainly when we remove barriers or structure the work in a way that is more flexible, like we've done during COVID, it opens up all sorts of opportunities and possibilities, right? So I remember, before COVID, oh, you can't work at home, it's impossible. We used to get human rights cases, you can't do that, it just won't work. Well, of course, now we know it does work. And not that everyone with a disability wants to work at home. In fact, isolation can be a problem, but it does open up flexibility without thinking about it as an accommodation. It's simply, this is the way we can structure the work and address people's, the diversity of needs. But at the same time, I think there are some times people just can't imagine how we could accommodate or have somebody with a disability within the institution. And sometimes that's an institutional problem, is that, the directive of the institution is, let's be diverse. Let's recruit from diverse communities. Let's recruit people with disabilities. But then the managers aren't given any resources in how to do that, in terms of, are there additional costs, even if they're small? No one has extra money in their budget. Is it going to take some time? Who's going to assist in working with the employee to design and determine what accommodations they need? Like, who's going to do that within the organization? So organizations need to think about that. The last thing I'll say is really an attitudinal thing. And, I've experienced it myself as a person with a disability, often managers or people will look, we know that many people with who don't have disabilities are uncomfortable with people with disabilities, or put another way, people with disabilities make people without disabilities uncomfortable, in the sense that, and there's been a lot written about this, it confronts people with their own mortality, right? Or it's like, oh my God, like, anyone can become disabled, tomorrow, wake up in a week, and that scares people. And so people with disabilities can make people feel uncomfortable on that human level. And what that sometimes does is, and we've heard this, and people may have experienced it, is I think it's natural, is like, oh my God, if I was blind, like, there's no way I could do my job. Like, I just couldn't do my job if I was blind. Like, how is this person going to do their job? Like, I couldn't do it, right? And so, but of course, that's not the question on the recruitment. It's not how you're going to do your job. It's how I'm going to do my job. And so the fact that you maybe not be able to do your job if you were blind is not the point. The point is that when you look at my resume, and I'm not to trumpet myself, but just as an example, I have all sorts of experience leading organizations of different kinds. I've experienced as a lawyer, as a decision maker, and all these things. And I've done that with my disability. So I think people have to be careful not to let their, it's not so much biases as almost fear and putting themselves in the place of the person who is being recruited and falling into that pit of saying, oh, I couldn't do that if I were them. But again, that's not the point. The point is, does this person have the capacity?
Thank you for those insights. And I think some of what you've just said perhaps flows into some other interests that are in the chat now around whether you could perhaps share some of your insights, whether it's from your current roles perspective or your history working in this space, but about sort of the next step. So once an organization perhaps successfully recruits a number of diverse individuals with particular strengths and challenges and talents, but how to sort of systematically set up the conditions for success within the organization and to really embrace the strengths of a diverse leadership context for those individuals and for those individuals to then progress into leadership roles.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, I mentioned before, I think I think many organizations and have for a number of years set up recruitment processes of various kinds that that recognize that there may be hidden biases, embedded biases in a traditional recruitment approach. You know, so whether that's how you design how you draft the job description, who's on the interview panel, what the interview questions are do you ask about experience or do you ask about skills base? There's pros and cons, those sorts of things. Biases that, well, this person has a 6-year, has a 3-year gap in their resume. There's something wrong with this person, right? Without understanding that there may be different reasons for people's diverse experience. So as I said, I think most institutions have thought about that and have implemented that. The key is to stick with it, right? In the tough times when you're pressured and so forth, and not to say, well, we'll do it next time. So I think that's one thing. I talked about resources and making sure the organization does have, I know universities, for example, have disability and accommodation policies for students, so all organizations should have people who are expert or can be coordinators for that, because line managers just aren't going to have the time. I think the third thing that's important is education and just awareness of disability, right? And part of that is, oh yeah, well that's really cool. This person is blind, or this person is deaf, or this person has this or that disability, and they've been really successful. Well, that's good, but it's also moving beyond that, and recognizing that people with diverse backgrounds strengthen the organization. I mean, I know that, a lot of management consultants and, coaches and, there's saying that, what got us here won't get us there, right? Recognizing that we need to really diversify our workforce, not just because it reflects the face of the community, not just because it's the right thing to do and it's just and equitable. Those are all important things, but it also will bring us to, it will bring new ideas and fresh ideas and innovate and excite the workplace and those sorts of things. So I think there's those, and then there's some specific practices that I've noticed that are, I think are pretty cool, like the, such as the federal government recently or for some time introduced what's called a passport, a disability accommodation passport. So when an individual with a disability enters the public sector, the public service, federal public service, they will work with an accommodation specialist who will assist in setting out their particular accommodation needs. And those will be documented so that when, if that individual over their career in the public service moves from a job to a job, they don't have to start the process all over. I mean, this is, the information belongs to the employee. It's not, there's privacy issues, but if an employee is working in one job and they're apply for another job, they don't have to start the process over. There's the documentation of the accommodation that they need, And so I thought that was a pretty interesting. It's small but large, but I thought that was quite an interesting approach. And it also shows a commitment on the part of the organization, of the government in this case, but of an institution that's committed to accommodation. Because people with disabilities, as you probably heard, people have talked about this, scholars have written about this, can be very hesitant to express what their needs are. Partly, there could be a number of reasons, but we're used to getting turned down, or people looking at us and thinking, or we feel that we're problems, or making problems, or a burden, or so we may ask for things, but not too much. So where you have a program like this that says, okay, let's set it all out. We're interested in this, and we encourage you to do that. I think that's very, very helpful.
Thank you. And again, a reminder to everyone to please do feel free to send your questions in the chat, and we'll continue to work through as many of them as we can during our time together this afternoon. There's a question around sort of what are sometimes framed as invisible disabilities, and the greater awareness growing in organizations about the need to accommodate more effectively individuals who, for example, are neurodiverse or have other, again, challenges that may not have been traditionally captured in some of the sort of more original forms of accessibility and the focus of removing barriers in those contexts. And this person is wondering if you have any thoughts or insights around sort of the future in these areas and where we need to see organizations move to better accommodate individuals, again, who may be neurodiverse or have other forms of less visible types of disability.
Well, this is certainly an emerging area. All right, and I think to some extent, part of the challenge is that it's an invisible disability, right? So that the manager, the fellow employees, the colleagues may not realize that the individual has a disability, and then you get into the whole question: do they have an obligation to disclose, and what do they disclose or not? When do they disclose it? I know, human resource professionals around the table today probably are well experienced with, the situation where it's not until a problem arises, a conflict that might even be seen as disciplinary, and then the individual might disclose that they have a disability, and there are challenges obviously in those situations. I mean, there's an obligation to accommodate, but certainly it's not the ideal situation. So I think that encouraging people to identify accommodation needs in a respectful way upfront, during not the hiring process, but after the person's hiring, during the onboarding process, I think can be helpful, ensuring that that process, respects the confidentiality of information that might be disclosed. That it's not going to be widely shared within the workplace, but it's sort of as needed. But I think the other part of it is we just need to have more diverse or neurodiverse or diverse people in the workplace. It's not that long ago that people in wheelchairs or people who were blind weren't allowed to travel alone. I mean, we're just talking, 60 years ago. In my lifetime, because they were just thought to be a problem, or less than capable, or people in wheelchairs used to be called a fire hazard. You can't come into the building because you're a fire hazard, or you can't board a train because you're a fire hazard. Or there were, not that long ago, maybe 80 years ago, what some scholars have written as the ugly laws, right? People with various disabilities were said that they can't participate because their appearance caused distress amongst the general population. Right? Well, people still face this discrimination and inclusion, but I think those kinds of attitudes are not as, not prevalent, or not as prevalent. So I think, when individuals who, as you say, neurodiversity, individuals with autism, with communication disabilities, people whose disability might mean that they have, they get excited and hand movements and, raising their voice, or becoming very quiet, or those sorts of things. I think when we recognize that this is part of who they are and part of their experience, and we're not fearful of it, we don't think it's, to use the analogy, we don't think it's ugly, and we don't want it in our face. As more people with disabilities are out there in the world, a part of our community, and participating in very important ways, and I think, hopefully, we're on a journey to respect people's diversity.
Thank you. We have a question from a participant who is with Barrier Free Saskatchewan, where nothing about us without us is the motto. And they're hoping you could perhaps speak to federal government's Bill C-22 and some of the rationales that may be driving that initiative.
Right. So Bill C-22 is a disability benefit, Canada Disability Benefit. And I'm not I'm not responsible or involved in that at all in my role. But I do know it's a piece of legislation that has been introduced. It's gone through second reading. It's at a standing committee currently. It did receive unanimous support on first and second reading. The principle there is to lift people with disability out of poverty. We know that people with disabilities live in poverty at twice the rate of the general population. I should say Indigenous people with disabilities live in poverty at 3 times the rate of the general population. So there are, and we've known for years that in part because of the discrimination and barriers where people with disability aren't able to enter the workforce, but I think the statistics statistics show that, there are many people with disabilities that would not be able to enter the workforce as it currently sort of stands. So in any event, poverty, which then leads to marginalization, housing, the lack of the ability to find affordable housing. These are things that have been identified by people with disabilities in government consultations as some of the highest priorities. So as a result, the government indicated they were going to introduce Canada Disability Benefit. So if you can think, there's a child benefit up until a certain age, there's the OAS and guaranteed income supplement for people over 65. This is to cover that period in between for people with disabilities, to ensure that to lift people with disabilities above the poverty line. There's been a lot of consultations with people with disabilities. As I said, this has been identified by the disability community as one of the priority areas in terms of lifting people with disability out of poverty. And the complexity, though, as I understand it, of this is because, of course, income support programs and disability support programs are provincially funded, provincially delivered, rather, right? So there needs to, my understanding is that the government is committed to ensuring that if it provides a disability benefit, those aren't clawed back by the government, by the provincial government. So they don't want people with disabilities to be worse off because of the benefit. But the concept, again, is to lift people with disabilities out of poverty. It's an income support program, and the bill is working its way through Parliament.
Thank you. We have another question from someone who indicates that they lead someone with a disability, and they're wondering whether you have any suggestions or resources or perhaps insights around helping them to ensure that their leadership style works well for that employee. So coming from a place of wanting to ensure that they are being appropriately accommodating and providing opportunities in an appropriate way that meets the needs of their staff members.
Well, I don't know the specific context, and obviously can't comment on specific cases. I think the principle within human rights is that individuals have the right to equal access to employment or services, or put another way, that an individual cannot be discriminated in the area of employment or the provision of goods and services. And discrimination can be intentional, or it can be, as I said before, unintentional. Sometimes it's called adverse effect. Essentially, that there is a job requirement or a policy, the structure of a position, a particular position, that means that the individual with disability is negatively affected by that policy or that provision in a job description or that sort of thing. So at that point, the individual with a disability would establish that they have a disability, that they are negatively affected by the policy or program within the workplace, for example, and that the disability is one factor in that negative impact, right? So it doesn't have to be the only factor, it doesn't have to be the most important factor, but that just is one of the factors. The disability is one of the factors. There's a connection between the disability and the negative impact of the rule or policy. At that point, the employer then has a duty to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. So the employer has to establish that the rule is justified. It's not brought in bad faith. There's a legitimate business purpose for it. And once they do that, they have to work with the employee to accommodate the employee to be able to do the work. And that effort to accommodate is to the point of undue hardship. So that's sort of the legal and practical principles that have to be followed. And hopefully that discussion can happen within the context of the workplace without a human rights complaint being filed. But ultimately, the employee could choose, if they don't have, can't get a result that they're satisfied with, file a human rights complaint.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier that, I think you sort of used the perhaps framing that this legislation is sort of the next generation perhaps of human rights legislation, or sort of as an evolution of work in that area. And there's some interest in terms of hearing your thoughts about kind of the need and power of a legislative approach vis-a-vis other policy instruments, and perhaps sort of broader cultural shifts when it comes to, again, truly removing barriers to embrace inclusion more fully in our workplaces. Is that something you feel you might be able to comment on, again, whether in your current position or by virtue of your previous experience?
Yes, so I think, certainly I do think there's a cultural shift. I hope there's a cultural shift. Certainly the legislation, accessibility legislation, is trying to highlight and is built around the concept that people with disabilities are not problems to be dealt with, right? That or sometimes said, people without disabilities are responsible for supporting people with disabilities, and people with disabilities, their job is to receive support. That's not the kind of society that we see as inclusive. So these are the principles, right? That people with disabilities not only have the right to participate, but are part of the community. They already are part of the community, but because of barriers, they cannot fully participate. They cannot fully contribute. They cannot, they cannot participate in a way that they are valued in the community, as opposed to just being a drag on the community. So I think the legislation, which again is designed, so even to take one step deeper into the theory, is, and I think feminist theory has put it this way as well. I think it was Gloria Steinem said, the current society is a giant affirmative action policy for white men, right? So it's, I think there is a recognition generally, and a growing recognition that, and again, within, Indigenous reconciliation, within recognizing the impacts of racism, ableism, that things are structured in a way that benefit or have responded to the needs of a particular group, and has not recognized either the impact of that on other groups, but shuts out other groups as being full citizens. And I think people with disabilities have for many years felt that they, they're members of the community, and yet their rights, they don't have full rights in terms of being a citizen. And I use the word citizen in the broader sense, not citizen as opposed to refugee or permanent residents. That, whether it's a right to vote, it's whether it's a right to be out in the world, the right to take transportation, the right to go to films, the ability to be out in the world and not to be shut in and seen as a problem, that we have a moral and obligation to take care of these people. So I think that's what accessibility legislation is trying to turn around, saying that if we structured the world differently, it would be much more inclusive. and it would be much more just. I mean, let me give an example, my own example, and this goes back to recruitment. So when I applied for the job I'm in now as Accessibility Commissioner through an open process, government website, and that was good. The application form was accessible, and that worked well for me. But when I was called for an interview, and this was during the pandemic, I was told that it would be done online, which again is okay. But the government said that they were going to use this platform, this app, for the video interview. So it wasn't Zoom; it was some other, I forget the name of the application, but it what it did was, maybe there was more security, I don't know, but one of the features was that I was given questions in advance and I could make notes. All right, and I guess for the way the platform would work is that when the interview was going on, there would be one screen with the interview panel, and then there'd be a split screen on the other side would be the notes that the interviewee would had made, right? So that they could, at the same time, they'd have their interview notes, and they could see the interview panel. But the panel couldn't see the notes, right? Well, the problem with that is the interview notes weren't accessible. My screen reader didn't work, so I could read the interview notes. So, and this is for accessibility. So, I tried to explain, and they tried to do a workaround, and it meant I needed two computers, one for my notes and one for the interview. And it would just, not only wasn't it accessible, but here I am applying for a position, and it causes me to get flustered, and it doesn't work, and it's just problematic, right? So this is a perfect example where, when I talked about one of the focus of the Accessible Canada Act is, employment, services, transportation, information. One is procurement of goods and services. So presumably, in theory, if and when a regulation is passed about procurement, it would hopefully say that where an entity procures products, they have to be accessible, right? So hopefully that wouldn't happen. When the government went out and said, we need a product to be able to do video interviews, somebody would have checked to make sure that platform worked for someone like me with a screen reader.
That is a very powerful example. Thank you for sharing. And perhaps I guess it follows from that, but could you share sort of any updates with respect to where the regulation development is in relation to the legislation? And, perhaps to the point you've just touched on, how consultation and engagement with different disability communities perhaps is being wrapped into that process?
Yes, well, so I can't speak for the disability community about whether the consultation process has been sort of satisfactory. I know there has been a commitment by the government to consultation. I know that, for example, the Accessible Standards Canada, the entity I mentioned before that is responsible for developing standards, has an advisory group made up of, I think, mostly people with disabilities, almost like a board of directors. And certainly the Accessible Canada Act has, within the legislation, is based on the principle of nothing about us without us. So there's all sorts of focus on consultation. The only regulation currently enacted under the Accessible Canada Act is, and it sort of launches December 31st in sort of a month and a half, is that entities must develop and publish accessibility plans. So December 31st, all federal government departments, agencies, corporations, and so forth, crown corporations, must have developed and published an accessibility plan by June 1st of 2023. All other federally regulated entities with more than 100 employees have to publish their accessibility plan, and then a year later, entities with between 10 and 99 employees have to publish an accessibility plan. And that the accessibility plan, while it doesn't specify what needs to be in it, it does very clearly say that it must be developed through consultation with people with disabilities. And it must include a feedback process. So the regulation requires the publication of an accessibility plan. It contemplates a progress report after 1 year, and after 2 years, and then after 3 years, a new accessibility plan. So again, the development must be done through consultation with people with disabilities. The consultation process has to be set out in the plan, and there must be a feedback process that allows, as the plan is being implemented, that it allows for people to provide feedback, and that feedback has to be gathered and reported in the progress reports. So that, again, is not only consultation by the government in terms of developing the legislation, but really what it demonstrates and underscores the principle of nothing without us for entities that are moving to removing barriers and that journey.
Well, thank you very much. Well, with that, I know we are at the top of the hour and a number of participants have other commitments, and we want to thank you so much for your insights and comments and questions today, and for sharing with us your perspectives. I think you've really given us a lot of food for thought about taking proactive measures to removing barriers and to advancing careers of diverse team members. So thank you again so much for being with us today. Thank you to all of you who have been here with us and for your questions and participation in this series. If you enjoyed this lecture, please do keep an eye on JSGS's events calendar for notifications about future events, as well as information about our various programs that we offer through the school and information sessions that are available there. Karen will be posting some links in the chat about some of these upcoming events and where you can find more information. And at this time, I would invite everyone to please join me using your reactions button if you wish, in offering a round of applause and thanks to Commissioner Gottheil for his time and for sharing his expertise with us today. Thank you so much again. And thank you
so much.
Hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.